Welcome to Recovery Talk, February 19th, 2019. This is your mobile meeting. This first reading comes from the Doctor's Opinion, page XXV in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. It says, "We of Alcoholics Anonymous believe that the reader will be interested in the medical estimate of the plan of recovery described in this book. Convincing testimony must surely come from medical men who have had experience with the sufferings of our members and have witnessed our return to health. A well-known doctor, chief physician at a nationally prominent hospital, specializing in alcoholic and drug addiction, gave Alcoholics Anonymous this letter." And then it says, "To whom it may concern, I have specialized in the treatment of alcoholism for many years. In late 1934, I attended a patient who, though he had been a competent businessman of good earning capacity, was an alcoholic of a type I had come to regard as hopeless." Okay, so now I'm just going to share some of my experience on this paragraph here. And what this is, it's a doctor who was treating alcoholics and addicts in the 1930s. He's writing a letter on behalf of Alcoholics Anonymous to basically give his opinion. Exactly what it says. And one of the interesting things about this is that in the first printing, he left his name off. Later, he included his name as Dr. William Silkworth. And in the first printing, his name was omitted from this letter. But then in subsequent printings, as Alcoholics Anonymous grew, for whatever reason, they decided to put his name back again. One of the interesting things I find about this letter is that later on he says something like, "The only relief we have to suggest for alcoholics and addicts is entire abstinence." And so, to me, that was an indication that this doctor was not an alcoholic or an addict, because for him, the idea of abstinence from alcohol or from intoxicants, from addictive behaviors, is relieving. But to me, as a person who is all of the above, the idea of abstinence actually is not relieving. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It starts off, typically a period of abstinence that I had would begin with some real depressing event, some real demoralizing event, or something that caused me a lot of shame and remorse. And then I would reflect on, how I should get my stuff together and start to turn my life around. And so, for the next, however long I could make it, I would try to do that. I would try to live like I saw, quote unquote, normal people living. And what would happen would be that I didn't get the same satisfaction that I thought other people got out of going to work and doing the right thing, whatever that might have been, and day by day, as I stayed sober, life actually got more painful for me, and eventually the same pattern would repeat. I would get sober because I needed to, or because I wanted to, or because something had happened. I was afraid of repeating some behavior. And then day by day, as life went on, me trying to pretend to be a normal person without using anything, alcohol or drugs, eventually life, like the color seemed to just drain out of life and it was as if I were walking against I was trying to walk forward and there was some magnetic force pulling me back. And basically what I'm saying is it got depressing, I got isolated, I got stuck in negativity, and I didn't understand how people could live in this world and be happy doing the things I saw them doing, going to work, buying things, having families. None of this made sense to me. I certainly couldn't do it. And so eventually I would drink again, or I would use again, or I would act out in some other behavior that would make me feel ashamed, and so then, drinking and using would sound like a good idea. So at this point in the book, they haven't really talked about, the solution except in the forewords. And back in the 30s, they didn't really have effective treatment for alcoholism, for drug addiction. And even before that, it was worse than... So back in the 30s, 20s, 1920s, 1930s, what would happen to you is you would get locked up, you would go to the hospital, you would get shock treatment, you would get what what Bill Wilson got, which was called the belladonna treatment, which was something that tried to flush you out. You should probably look it up, but basically it made you vomit and have diarrhea and also hallucinate. Yeah, fun times. So that's what happened to you back then. And even before then, going back in time, what would happen to alcoholics? Maybe somebody would, now I'm not sure exactly about this, but I've heard people say it, maybe they would think you were a witch and burn you at the stake because you're an alcoholic, or, who knows. But right at this point in the 30s, we were about to have a glimmer of hope. Now, there was a time before Alcoholics Anonymous in the 1800s where there was a group called the Washingtonians who did amass a large membership even before we had cell phones or telephones. And they did amass a large membership of people staying sober from drinking. And they used like a similar technique that the people use in Alcoholics Anonymous, which mainly in AA and in NA, in these 12-step programs, it's the idea of identification, of one alcoholic talking to another, one addict talking to another. And I've heard it said, it relieves our feelings of difference enough that we can start to take the actions, i.e. work the steps, or whatever other actions, a person in recovery has discovered work for them. Okay, so personally for me, I found that when I had a lot of attempts at trying to get sober, and then when I actually did get sober, a lot of it was because I had determined that I would have to figure out, what I was gonna, that it was resting on my shoulders, basically. I'd been to AA, I had been to therapy, and finally I got to the point where, I was living on the street, I didn't have a job, I didn't have any friends left because I had used them up, essentially, and no, pretty much more than, and so I decided, this is my responsibility to do something different, and I started to take into practice the things I'd heard in meetings and things I'd learned other places too. I didn't like the idea of God for whatever reason. And so, but I had read a book that talked about how a belief in a God was hardwired into a human being's neurobiology. And so it started to sound to me like a belief in a higher power could just be a tool that I could use, instead of it having to be a reality. Like, instead of me having to believe these ridiculous sounding claims, to me they were ridiculous, that these miracles had happened, or like that this person could talk, all these crazy things that religions want you to believe. No offense, that's just my opinion. Um, well, I couldn't buy into it, but I could buy into the idea that I could act as if, that I could use this idea that human beings are hardwired for belief to start to put my faith in something outside of myself. And also, I had learned about the idea of substitution, and in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, it talks about, do we have a sufficient substitute for alcohol? And I started to substitute some of my old behaviors with new behaviors. I started to set goals for myself. I started to keep myself busy. And I eventually, after I was sober just a little while, I finally broke down and got a sponsor. And the reason I did was because I asked this guy to be my mentor, because I was convinced that if I had had more money, if I'm going to be sober, I need a reward. I should become a millionaire. So I knew a guy who was a millionaire, and I asked him to be my mentor. And he said he'd be more comfortable sponsoring me. So I got a sponsor because of that. But also, I realized I'd been sober a while. I realized that if I stayed sober long enough, I would drink again. And I knew that I had always drank again. And so I didn't want to, because I didn't want to go back to living on the street, not having a place to sleep, wringing out my socks, giving plasma, so on and so forth. Living in the little homeless shelters for 3 nights at a time. Did not want to do that. And that's where I ended up. And it was not a stretch of the imagination, since I had no resources. And even if I did, I knew, like, I wasn't able to keep a job. I wasn't able to save money. Like, I didn't have any of those skills. And so it was inevitable that if I did drink again, I would be back on the street or trying to find someone I could use. And so I got a sponsor, and I decided to try a 12-step program again, to really try it. And I've been using the ideas I had learned in 12-step programs up to that point. Like, for example, I'd heard in 12-step programs that you have to do what you say you're going to do. And so as soon as I got to a place where I was sober, I started to practice that. Like, if I set a goal for myself, or if I said I was going to do something, then I would make myself do it. And so this really went against the grain, because most of the time I did not feel like it. But because I think of the desperation I had, I was able to oppose those feelings and that discomfort, and I was able to keep my commitments to myself when I said I was going to do something. And then I was also able to start to be completely honest with myself, which was something I had attempted before, but I was never really quite sure. I was still delusional to the point that I wasn't quite sure, if I was lying or if I was telling the truth. And so along with that, substituting other behaviors, I joined a running team, which was amazing. I started having more goals. I started filling up my downtime, because it turns out, as I would look back and see, downtime was really not a really productive thing for me, and it typically led me to seek out behaviors that were counterproductive. And so that was actually a pretty good instinct that I had. So that that's all I'm going to share for today. I hope that you found some kind of experience, strength, and hope in this and look for the next one soon.